Meredith Alexander Coons, the author of The Stoic Mom Substack and co-author of Beyond Stoicism and Live Like a Philosopher. Today, my guests are my two co-authors, Massimo Pigliucci and Gregory Lopez. And we have had a long-time collaboration across the miles, with me here in the West Coast in the US and California, and the two of them in New York City in the East Coast. We finally had the chance to meet in person, all three of us, in February to celebrate our book's launch. And now I'm really excited to have these two awesome writers and practitioners of Stoic philosophy here with me today to have a conversation. So I'll introduce both of them with a little bit of background. First of all, Massimo. He is the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York. And he's written for New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Philosophy Now, among others. He's the author and editor of 16 books, which amazes me, including How to Be a Stoic and The Quest for Character and others. And he is my co-author. And Greg is a practicing Stoic and secular Buddhist, and he's founder of the New York City Stoics, co-founder and board member of the Stoic Fellowship, co-host of the Stoic Camp in New York, and he's part of Modern Stoicism on that team. And he's published essays on Stoicism in the Stoicism Today blog and Philosophers magazine, and again is my co-author. So Massimo and I fairly recently saw each other for a seminar that we co-taught in Athens, focused on our book this summer. And Greg, haven't seen you for a number of months. How are you both doing?
I'm pretty
doing
good.
well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. I'm glad to hear it. And here we are, September. And so, we're gonna get going with some questions about, I view this as a back to school season and also kind of back to philosophy season, maybe. I'm gonna ask a question and then maybe you could kind of take turns answering a little bit. And the question I have is just a very, very basic one. How did you get interested in philosophy? And how did you get interested in Stoicism in particular?
Greg, you want to go first?
Sure. I guess I had, I'm not exactly sure when I got into philosophy overall, but I remember kind of two pivotal moments that got me more into it, both in more college. I guess I transitioned from being a theist to an atheist in late high school, and that got me a little bit into philosophy. I then went to a liberal arts school where I read a few books and took a few courses that kind of made me deeper into philosophy. The first I remember that kind of seared itself into my mind was reading the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, which was kind of really allowed me to understand that ethics wasn't essentially just a stick to beat people over the head with, and that it could be methodically explored, and that you didn't have to necessarily focus on acts, but focus on character as well.
And you were brave to start with Aristotle, I'm just going to say.
It was
required reading.
Okay. Yeah, so bravery had nothing to do with it. More cowardice to not fail the course. But the second one was taking a metaphysics class. I wanted to take a couple of philosophy courses, so I took a metaphysics class. And although I'm not into metaphysics at all anymore and wasn't really into it during the course, it did teach me things like inconsistent belief triads and some philosophical methods that I found interesting, where you could only hold a certain subset of a set of beliefs consistently without contradiction. And so that got me into philosophy as a whole. Fast forward several years, and I decided to start volunteering and became president of an organization that teaches people with addictive behaviors, whether substance related or not, some forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. And there I saw the connection between Stoicism and cognitive behavior therapy and went deeper into that. I searched online at the time, and there were people trying to bring the philosophy of Stoicism into the modern world. And then I founded New York City Stoics in 2013 because the people who were doing it were primarily online. And I believe online interactions have some limits, so wanted to form an in-person group and took it from there.
And so the connection with cognitive behavioral therapy is kind of what led you to the Stoic piece, or is that right?
Specifically Stoicism, yes. In college, I also did read Seneca, but it was just one set of reading amongst many, so I didn't really pick up Stoicism or put it into context until the connection to cognitive behavior therapy later on down the road.
That's really interesting. And talk about the practical applications. That is one of the key applications in the modern world of Stoic thinking. Massimo, how about you?
Well, it started also in high school. Also, when I was in the process of leaving the Catholic Church and becoming an atheist. At the same time, I was growing up in Italy, and there, in many high schools, you have to take 3 years of philosophy. And I was lucky enough that my teacher was just wonderful. So she introduced me to philosophy as a way of thinking. In fact, she got me this close from switching in college from biology, which was my original intention, to philosophy. I did not. I stuck with biology, but it was close. And then many years later, so philosophy became kind of a background, first philosophy of science in particular. My early influence was Bertrand Russell, both, of course, why I'm not a Christian, but also his more sort of logically oriented work. So it kind of stuck in my mind. And then many years later, I went through a little bit of a midlife crisis, nothing spectacular, a divorce, my father dying, that sort of stuff. But a number of things did happen in the span of a few months that kind of caused a little bit of a crisis. And I reached out to what I thought was my philosophy of life, so to speak, which was secular humanism, and didn't really find much useful there. It's like, I still agree with the general ideas, universal human rights, reason, science, go, blah, blah. But when it came to actual things like the stuff that I was, actual setbacks, like the stuff that I was facing, it wasn't particularly useful. Since I was studying philosophy at the time, because then that was the time also that I decided to move academically from biology to philosophy, I thought, okay, let's do this philosophy thing, not only for academic reasons, but also at a more personal level. I started exploring what people told me were the most practical philosophies of life. In fact, beginning with Buddhism, but Buddhism didn't really speak to me. Partly the language is alien to my sort of Western analytical mind, at least the books that I had access at the time. I also couldn't get my mind around the physics that at least some of the schools of Buddhism endorse. I thought, no, wait a minute, I left the Catholic Church for something similar to this, so I'm not going to go back to it. Pretty quickly, it turned out that I'd zeroed in on virtue ethics, and sure enough, I went to Aristotle. In my case, on purpose, because my teachers told me, "Yep, that's where you want to start. If you're interested in virtue ethics, go there." I found Aristotle interesting. I found it, however, also not particularly practical. Again, at least not in his writings, and a little bit of an elitist. The notion that in order to live a eudaimonic life, life worth living, you have to have not only virtue, but also a little bit of money, a little bit of education, even good looks. I said, oh,
Right.
I'm screwed. And, that's it. We're done. Now, secular humanists are also often into Epicurean, because Epicureanism is science friendly-ish, the whole atomist thing. Also, Epicurus, although he was not an atheist, he certainly downplayed the role of the gods. The gods are doing what gods do, but they don't really care about us. So don't pray, don't waste your time praying. There was the whole bit about not being afraid of death. So a lot of secular humanists, actually, if they've heard of virtue ethics, they tend to be into, or ancient philosophy, I guess, ancient Greco-Roman philosophy, they tend to be into Epicurus. So I did that too. I explored that part as well. But then the goal of life there is, lack of pain and tranquility of mind. There is a pretty clear advice to not engage unless absolutely necessary into social and political issues, because that, of course, does get in the way of your tranquility.
Causes
and,
stress,
which
lots of
we
stress.
know,
Yeah,
which we
yeah.
certainly know.
Certainly no.
So it's true, but I couldn't see myself doing that sort of life. So I was there in the middle of, pretty much sure that I was zeroing in into the general area that was going to work, but not really sure where to go next. And then all of a sudden I saw this tweet, at the time was called, on what's now called X, but at the time was Twitter. And it said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I thought, the hell is Stoic Week? And why would anybody celebrate the Stoics? Because of course I thought about the Stoics like, Mr. Spock from Star Trek. Depressing emotion, stiff upper lip. And by the way, Spock is my favorite character in all of Star Trek and probably across a number of other series. Nevertheless, I wouldn't want to live like him.
Right.
So I thought, but then I remember, it's like, okay, wait a minute. Stoicism also was a type of virtue ethics. It falls into the general category that I'm interested in. I remember having read Marcus Aurelius in college on my own. I found it interesting. Back in high school, I had translated Seneca, a little bit of Seneca. I found it also interesting, although at the time I didn't put the two together. I really didn't think, oh, Marcus and Seneca, same stuff. It didn't occur to me. So I thought, okay, let's give it a try. And here we are. I
Here
gave it a
we
try.
are. Here we are. And I also have to credit you, Massimo, with helping me get interested in Stoicism 10 years ago when I saw your opinion piece in the New York Times talking about how Stoicism doesn't have to be the stiff upper lip. In fact, it's about virtue ethics and it's about how we live and how we can live better. And when I saw that, it really triggered something in my mind because I had already been interested in ancient history and ancient thought. And I still recall like looking at Epictetus many, many years ago. But when I saw your story, I thought this is bringing it to life today and how we can really use this. So I credit you for that as well. And I
You
think
know,
you go ahead.
sorry, there is a funny story about that piece. That was the very first thing that I wrote about Stoicism.
Mm,
And it came about because of this. At the time, the New York Times had an online section called The Stone, in the
yes.
Philosopher's Stone, right?
Yeah.
Which was asking professional philosophers to write for a more general public, trying to convey why philosophy is relevant and so on and so forth. So the editor, Peter Catapano, asked me a year earlier to write about what my actual specialty, which is the philosophy of science and specifically the demarcation between science and pseudoscience. And so I wrote an article. It was published in the New York Times, etc. So I knew Peter. So when I started doing this experiment on myself, basically trying Stoicism for some time on myself, the idea occurred to me. I said, hey, Peter, I'm doing this thing. Are you by any chance interested in a short article about a professional philosopher who's going through a midlife crisis and is trying to experiment on himself? And he said, oh, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So we published this thing, which was called How to Be a Stoic. And then Peter calls me up the following day and he says, Massimo, I'm very happy that we published it. It's the most emailed story on the site. And I said, wow, on the Stone site. And he said, no, the New York Times site. It's like, what?
Amazing.
Why are so many people? Okay. So I hang up with Peter and I was at City College in my office. Half an hour, maybe an hour later, the phone rings, which is unusual because in my office, the phone never rings. And I pick up the phone. I said, and I hear, hi, we are from Penguin. We saw your article in the New York Times. Are you thinking by any chance of writing a book about this thing? And I thought, well, thanks for your interest, but no, not really. This was just one-off kind of thing. And it's like, but I'll keep it in mind. Okay. An hour later, hi, we are from Garzanti, which was an Italian publisher. We read the article in the New York Times. Are you interested in writing a book?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I thought, maybe.
Did it take the third call?
Third call comes in. Princeton Press. Are you thinking? Yes, I am. My agent is going to get in touch with you.
Yes, that's great.
And sure enough, the book that came out was entitled, the same title as the column, How to Be a Stoic. And it was a bestseller to my surprise. It was like, wow, who are these people who are interested in this stuff? So, but yeah, it worked.
Hugely popular book. And also, I think there's a reason why the article was hugely popular too, because you had a really, really great way of introducing it as something very useful to, as I said, like practical living, but also has a basis in, an intellectual tradition of ancient philosophy. And you did that in a very kind of a quick take. So I was one of those people reading it and thinking, oh, wow, that's so, I remember I was sitting in my office, I was working at Stanford at the time, and I thought, this is so interesting. I started sending it to people and they probably thought I was a little crazy at the time, but then, I wasn't. So this is good. This is a good thing. And as they say in journalism, 3 makes a trend. So once you had 3 publishers,
right,
you knew. Yeah, no, this is great. I'm happy you did that, and I'm happy it went in the direction it did. And so kind of back to your own lives, I wonder if you'd share, you've both been practicing Stoicism for a while, me too, but I'd really love to hear from you which concepts or ideas or practices from Stoicism stand out to you as the most helpful. And are there any that your students or people you write for particularly seem to respond to?
Well, I guess overall, it depends on what you mean by helpful, because I've come across for other people kind of 2 different modes, things that people approve of and like and make them feel good and make sense, and things that kind of get them a little bit more toward the meat of Stoicism, which I think is the ethics. So answering your first question, I would say that the thing that helps me the most is probably the role ethics, which is something that's not talked about too much. and it's kind of best explicated, in my view, in an academic but perfectly readable book by Brian Johnson, The Role Ethics of Epictetus. But there are essentially 2.5 or 3 versions of role ethics that you can see throughout Stoic history, starting with fragments from Ariston, who was a heterodox Stoic, moving on to the Middle Stoics and Panaetius, and then the most famous and fleshed out according to our records is Epictetus's version. So in short, what it is, what I find useful is just saying what's the most appropriate action given the role I'm currently in. So as a silly example, if you're at work, you are there to work and not necessarily to scroll social media or something like that. And so I'm here as a worker, therefore work is the most appropriate action. So that's that in a nutshell. In terms of what other people kind of find useful, I would say it is probably at this point we have enough data to suggest that it's unfortunately named the dichotomy of control, that it brings a lot of people into Stoicism, but it makes a lot of sense to them in a twisted way, but it actually leads people away from the Stoic practice because they kind of just stop there and use the dichotomy of control as a form of resilience training. And resilience without ethics essentially makes a world full of resilient assholes, or could. And I think that's not a great way to take a philosophy of life that is based on trying to bring humanity together and to work together to be pro-social. So in a sense, the dichotomy of control is something that people like, but also I spend a lot of time at New York City Stoics trying to give a little bit more nuance as to what that really means.
Right. I mean, my take on that is we also have to couple that with the Stoic virtues and what does it mean to aim for virtue in your own life. And I think, I've read a few things recently about how kind of virtue ethics did fall greatly out of favor in academic circles and also even in kind of the culture, which we can see today so many ways. And I think that we need to bring it back. I know some people have worked on this, and I'm not an academic myself, but I feel that as just a human, coupling this idea of what's up to me and what's not up to me with how can I aim to have this more virtuous action and thought and behavior is the only way to go. I mean, that's what I think. It's the only way to go against it in a way. What do you think about that concept, Greg?
I mean, so it's a 2-step thing. And so I think you could actually kind of do it in 1 step by kind of thinking about what's up to you, or as Massimo aptly named it, and I try to mimic Epictetus's fundamental rule as opposed to the dichotomy of control, because the dichotomy of control, first of all, is not something that Epictetus says. It is a label slapped on. The earliest I think I was tracing it to was William Irvine's book, A Guide to the Good Life. But it's close to what the words on their surface mean, but it's not exactly that, because it brings up a whole bunch of questions. People start arguing over what's under your control, and then people use it to resilience. And if you add virtue to that, it's kind of like resilience and then virtue later. Whereas I kind of think you could move it in a single stroke if you understand what Stoicism more properly is. And then there's also a common New York City criticism, which is like, virtue and 290 will get me on the subway. Why should I care about virtue? And that brings up a whole other can of worms.
There's definitely a lot of cans of worms, and I'm sure we could spend a whole series on this. Well, I'd love to hear from Massimo, and then maybe we could see if we can tell people something about what they could do.
Well, so in my case, what I find most useful is really at 2 levels, which I think it's in agreement with Greg's general approach. That is, too many people today, unfortunately, use Stoicism as kind of a life hack, which, at one level, there is nothing wrong with it. I mean, if a technique helps you living, with less stress and better quality of life, sure, go ahead. But that's not the philosophy. And as Greg pointed out, just a life hack can turn you into a very efficient asshole, which is, we have enough of those in modern society. We don't need to add to the number. So in my case, I think the kinds of things that have been most useful all come from Epictetus. Epictetus was really the first Stoic that I reread once I got into Stoicism, and it really clicked immediately. Like a few lines into the discourse, and I thought, wow, who is this guy? And more importantly, why have I not heard of him, even though I took graduate level courses in ancient philosophy?
Yes,
I mean, how does that work, right? Turns out Epictetus was actually a household name until the 19th century. So until fairly recently, all the so-called founding fathers of the American Revolution, they all had a copy of Epictetus in their libraries. So it's like, what the heck? But then, philosophy became more professionalized. There was this turn towards so-called analytical philosophy and sort of focus on language and all that sort of stuff. So practical philosophy as a way of life kind of went away throughout the 20th century. And we are now trying to bring it back. So Epictetus has been by far my leading light in this case. And so it has given me two things at different levels. One is the big picture, what Greg was suggesting was referring to as the ethics. I take role ethics at heart. I take his cosmopolitanism at heart. I've always been a cosmopolitan in some sense, meaning somebody who thinks that ideally, at least, we should strive to treat everybody else on earth as brothers, sisters, or whatever. And so those are the high-level approaches. Though that's the ethic, the discipline of action, one of the famous three disciplines of Epictetus that deals with how to interact with other people. To me, those things have provided a very welcome general framework so that now every time that I face an issue, a decision to make, priorities to establish, and so on and so forth, I use that kind of framework. Is this cosmopolitan or at least goes into that direction? Is it in accordance with the discipline of action? Is it in sync with the roles that I decided to play in my life? So that's the big level picture. At the more local level, the two things that I found, the three things I guess that I found most useful in Stoicism, again, all come from Epictetus. One is this infamous dichotomy of control, which Greg says I prefer to call the fundamental rule, because it's very practical, right? So once you have this general framework of the ethical framework, it is very practical in any particular situation. I do ask myself now almost automatically, what here is up to me and what is not up to me, and that helps. Immediately, it calms you down. It refocuses your attention where your agency is maximized, and it allows you to actually deal with things. That's one thing. The other one is Epictetus's explicit advice not to go to bed. In one of the translations, one of my favorite translations says, "Don't let your tender eyelids close before you examine your day and ask yourself, how the hell did I do today?" Right? So that's the people typically when they think about journaling, philosophical journaling, they think about Marcus Aurelius and the Meditations. Sure, but both Epictetus and Seneca actually explicitly say that is what you should do. And so that's another thing that I get from Epictetus. And the third one is this notion, this more general notion that Bill Irvine, in one of his later books, The Stoic Challenge, calls the framing effect, which also comes from Epictetus, even though now it's very well established in modern psychology. But when Epictetus says that it is not things that disturb us, but how we think about things, what he's getting at is a really fundamental idea, which is there is a distinction between externals, things in the world, other people, events, and so on and so forth, which you may be able to influence, but you certainly don't control. They're not up to you. And and how you think about those things and how you think about them is in fact up to you and makes a huge difference. And when we know that empirically from other empirical research, that if you train yourself to think about things from a different perspective, to turn a potential setback into a challenge, to go back to the title of Bill's book, it helps. Again, however, I stress that I agree with Greg, that all of these two or three techniques that I just mentioned, they could be done by anybody, including psychopaths. And what really differentiates Stoicism is the broad ethical picture, not the specific techniques.
Do you write in a journal, Massimo?
Yes, I've been doing that since almost uninterruptedly since I started practicing, which means that now I have more than a decade worth of journal, which is electronic, encrypted, of course, because unlike Marcus, I don't want to chance it that somebody else is going to read it after I'm dead.
Massimo's meditations.
Well, and yes, so one of the advantages of doing it electronically, of course, is that you can tag things and you can do searches so that I can compare. I can look at, for instance, what are the things that bothered me the most over the last few years. I can read entries on the same problem, let's say irritability or anger issues from 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and see what is it that was causing that and how I dealt with it.
That's so interesting and inspiring. I do a little journaling, but I always kind of leave it to the last minute and then I'm too tired. But I think this is really a good idea to make it a practice because, it's just a way of reflecting. I mean, I think one thing I've learned about Stoicism and I guess philosophy in general is it's hard work. I mean, it's if you are going to practice these ways of thinking and ways of living, you have to be constantly self-aware and examining your own thoughts and actions in this very kind of, in a way, hypercritical, but still neutral way. I mean, not using all the, as they call them in coaching, like saboteur voices, but instead kind of looking at your actions, thoughts, behaviors in something of a more
You know,
neutral way, I think. What do you think
yeah.
about that?
So that brings me to my mind a question that a number of journalists have asked me over the years. Their point typically is, yes, because Stoicism requires constant practice and attention and all that sort of stuff. It's like, oh, well, but isn't that an elitist thing? Isn't that because you're privileged that you can do this kind of thing and so on and so forth? And I said, no, bullshit. When I was a Christian, I was doing the same. You were paying attention. I mean, if you try to be a good Christian, as opposed to just a guy that goes to church once every 6 months, right? You are supposed to act as a Christian in everything you do, to pay attention
Yes.
every minute of your life, to read scriptures, to talk to other people about it, and so on and so forth. So it's no more demanding than any other philosophy or
Hmm.
religion. And Christianity doesn't strike me, nobody would describe Christianity as an elitist thing that only the rich people and the
Right.
privileged can
Right.
actually
Or
practice.
as easy. I mean, it's
Or as
not,
easy,
right?
that's right.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Super interesting. I mean, I think these are all things that I'm glad you point that out to people. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about our book. In the North America market, it's called Beyond Stoicism. In the UK, Live Like a Philosopher. And aside from Stoicism, we covered 12 other schools of Greek and Roman philosophy in that book. And I was curious about, these other practical philosophies that we looked into and explored, and which ones you felt drawn to, which ones you found interesting, and why.
So I guess overall, I think the main thing I took away from going deep into a deep dive was that I chose correctly. That Stoicism is probably a decent enough fit for me, and I am a mild eclectic, but not. I sometimes discourage people from eclecticism myself. Overall, if I got anything, so I wasn't drawn strongly toward anything. I think the main thing I would say is academic skepticism. Even going into Stoicism and before learning more about academic skepticism, I never bought some of the things the Stoics said about like the truth of your first certain kinds of impressions that you get, the so-called cataleptic impressions. That never seemed quite right to me. And academic skepticism kind of has a better take on how to figure out what's likely or not likely than Stoicism does, in my view. But that's like a kind of thing you could plug in into kind of how to train your thoughts. But there's overall, that was probably what I was most attracted to. Also, I had a respect already for other traditions because unlike the ancient Stoics who kind of thought that Stoicism was a fit for all people or the best fit because it was based on a true story of human nature and development, I don't necessarily buy their foundational argument. So I think at the end of the day, people can have different goals reasonably, and different kinds of philosophies will get you closer to your goals. I've always had a respect for Epicureanism, unlike the ancient Stoics again. But I think that it is a good fit for a lot of people, and also I gained a lot of respect for the Cyrenaics, who are like the hedonists in kind of a sensual, physical pleasure kind of sense. But there are plenty of delightful stories about its founder. Overall, he seemed to be a good, nice guy who was able to find joy in many situations and didn't necessarily have to partake as an unenlightened hedonist. And at the end of the day, he named his daughter after virtues. So out of
Right.
taste.
So you must have
He thought that was
loved virtue. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, one way or another. So yeah, so that was so I did gain respect for the Cyrenaics, but overall, I think if people follow these philosophies of life, I think the world would be a better place if more people at least were aware of them. Part of the reason why I co-wrote the book.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Question for you, Greg. When you mentioned about the way of telling if our impressions are accurate or not, what did you like about the academic skeptic approach? And could you kind of share with us what's appealing about how they define it?
Sure. So instead of saying that, so the ancient Stoics thought that there were certain kinds of impressions you get, and impressions is a technical term in Stoicism, but we could just take it as the first impressions you get of a situation. It's kind of a mix of what you see, smell, hear, taste, touch, but also your interpretations of it, the first things that come to mind. And so the Stoics thought that some of these impressions were called cataleptic, meaning they were stamped with reality. They came to your senses exactly as reality was. And the goal of Stoicism was to sort out the cataleptic impressions from the non-cataleptic impressions and only agree to what the cataleptic impressions are, the true facts impressions, and just go with that base set. The academic skeptics said you can't really find out exactly what's true, but instead you could take different levels of probability. And furthermore, depending on how important the thing is to you, you can dig more into it in order to try to get at a higher level of certainty. So they overall had 4 different levels. The first is just the first thing that comes to mind. The second is that, it seems really true on first blush. The third level is you've taken some time to compare it to other things you know and other things you experience, and there's no contradiction. So it seems like the evidence supports it, and that's the third level. And then the highest level is where you thoroughly examine the impression, where you have firm expertise, go about it, really, really dig into it. And so you don't want to do that for everything. You're not going to thoroughly explore where your bathroom is. You're going to get the first impression and just go there, turn right and go into the bathroom because good enough. But there are other things that have a lot higher stakes where you could dig more and more deeply. So there's no certainty in academic skepticism, but there is levels of certainty that require different levels of effort depending on levels of importance.
Yeah, it seems like a very scientific, in a way, modern way of looking at things. And I also found that pretty appealing. Massimo, how about you?
Well, just like Greg, in-depth dive into the other Hellenistic philosophies kind of confirmed to me that Stoicism is really the way to go. In fact, I go even a little further than Greg, and I say I actually do think that the Stoics are significantly better than any other of the other philosophies because they got closer, not quite right, but they got closer to a good picture of human nature. We have to remember the Stoics wrote 2000 before Darwin, right? So they didn't know anything about evolution. It's too much to expect that they actually got it completely right. But I do think that certainly fundamental aspects of human nature that should inform the way in which we live our lives are the fact that we are naturally pro-social. We are cooperative animals. Our survival and flourishing depends on cooperating with other people. In fact, there are modern versions of ethical theories based on cooperation, the evolution of cooperation. And we are capable of rationality. The fact that we, empirically speaking, turns out modern social psychology tells us that we rationalize more than we engage in rational thinking. It's true, but we are capable of rationality. We're capable of good level thinking. I don't think those are the only things. I think that the reason Stoicism is not completely accurate is because they were missing also that there is a significant balancing act that we need to do in terms of human nature. Yes, we're social and cooperative, but we also have a pretty decent degree of selfishness and self-regard and so on and so forth, probably more than the Stoics would have agreed. And as I said, we also rationalize a lot more than we reason. So I don't think they got everything right, but I think they got closer to the true picture than a lot of the other schools. That said, I think I learned that almost all of the other schools or almost all of the other thinkers has some interesting ideas that could easily be incorporated into one's own way of thinking. I like the Epicurean arguments against, being afraid of death, the symmetry argument. Why are you afraid of not existing for billions of years after your death if you're not concerned at all, not bothered at all by the fact that you did not exist for billions of years before you were born? I find that argument convincing. Now, is that going to completely do away with my fear of death? No, but I find it comforting. The notion that, okay, maybe you should be bothered or worried about the process of dying, but once you're dead, there's nothing there to worry because you're not there. I find that pretty convincing. I find the tetrapharmakos, the 4 cure from the Epicureans again, pretty reasonable. I find their classification of desires pretty reasonable and useful. But I also find things that some of the Cyrenaics or some of the Pyrrhonists said, for instance, Agrippa's trilemma, that comes from Pyrrhonism, this notion that whenever you make a statement, either a fact or theory, and somebody asks you why, on what basis you believe that, at the end of the day, there is only 3 ways to go about it. You either engage in an infinite regress, you engage in some kind of circular reasoning, or you stop and say, okay, this is just a brute fact. I'm going to start here. I think Agrippa was right. And that's a lesson of humility in terms of epistemology. So I think all of them really have something to contribute, although Stoicism remains the main one. Now, that said, however, I also agree with Greg that academic skepticism is the my second favorite, partly because I got interested in Cicero, who was one of the academic skeptics. My next book coming out next year is on Cicero. It's a philosophical biography of Cicero. But I also, like Greg, after the initial enthusiasm for Stoicism, because, oh, wow, I never heard of this thing. So let me learn as much as possible. Let me put it into practice as much as possible. Then you start paying attention to the details and you say, well, hold on. However, this thing, I'm not sure that I buy it. This other thing, man, maybe it's a little pushing and etc. And when I discovered Cicero, who was very much close to the Stoics, especially in terms of ethics, but even some of their metaphysics, and certainly would not have rejected. He doesn't seem to be that interested in logic, but I don't think he would reject the logic. So when I discovered Cicero, I thought, oh, here's a guy who, even though he doesn't claim himself to be a Stoic, he pretty much acts as a Stoic. He tends to agree with a lot of stuff, but there is this undercurrent of, yeah, but I reserve the right to change my mind. I reserve the right to keep assessing the likelihood of certain notions depending on new arguments and new evidence. And that resonated with me as a scientist, as somebody who's always been interested in skepticism in the broad sense. Again, remember I mentioned before my interest in pseudoscience. So that kind of sort of scientific skepticism. So at the moment, I kind of think of myself as a Stoic, broadly construed, although a modern Stoic, certainly not a traditional Stoic, and whose attitude, however, is fundamentally a skeptical one.
Yeah. Yeah. Everything you both said also resonates with me quite a lot from my experience working on the book. I was surprised by how many of these philosophies did have at least one aspect that I thought this really helps me rethink something, it kind of that I never quite considered. And of course, I always look back to the Cynics too, because I do think they're kind of this more radical version of the Stoics in some ways. And I find it really interesting to think about how they talked about, this bold speech, for example, like their ideas about freedom and how to live and how to behave. Well, probably leads to anarchy. Also, in a way, is a role model to me as someone who's sort of a recovering people pleaser. I love to look at how they defined, here's how you live a free life, here's how you live a good life, here's how you only focus on virtue. And I find that really interesting. I also think the skepticism, academic skepticism, turned out to be, I think, way more in keeping with modern thinking than I ever imagined it would be. And I agree about Aristippus too, about the Cyrenaics. I mean, this guy, he was pretty smart. I mean, he knew how to live well, and we live in a very consumerist society. And so maybe we relate to it a little bit that way. But what I loved about it is his idea that you can participate in these pleasureful things, but not be possessed by them and not be sort of completely overcome with this need. It's a very fine balance because he would seek them out, I guess, but he would go from thing to thing, just viewing it as, here's how it's adding to my existence. And yet I will maintain, this core of virtue, which I think is an interesting way to live.
Yeah, I think the Stoics, for instance, one of the things that, again, initially was helpful to me with Stoicism, because I do have issues with temperance in certain areas of my life. And so practicing temperance is a good thing for me. But nevertheless, at some point you get tired of Epictetus and Seneca and Marcus that degrade the body and say, the body is like that. You don't want to keep pay attention to that. Pleasure is bad.
Right.
Come on. I mean, even Seneca at some point finally says, I'm not stupid. I do prefer pleasure to pain. And I do prefer being healthy to being sick. It's just that those are not the paramount things.
Right.
If I have to be poor or in pain or sick, and yet I can still do some good, that's important. That is the most important thing for me. Then I agree. Turns out that we were discussing, actually, I think this recently with Greg and some of the students at Stoic Camp, which we do every year in New York in the Hudson Valley. And we were talking about the fact that evidence from modern psychology, so-called positive psychology, which is really the psychological version of the eudaimonic sort of approach. How do you live a good life? In fact, modern psychologists themselves actually use at this point the word eudaimonia to indicate at least a life that is oriented toward meaning, toward what we would call virtue. And modern positive psychology now has these rough sort of suggestion or advice for people: 80% eudaimonia and 20% hedonia, meaning build a life that is mostly based on meaningful activities, which turned out to be activities that are pro-social mostly, stamp collecting, it's not a particularly meaningful activity. It can be fun, but it's not a particularly meaningful activity. On the other hand, helping other people, or at whatever level, either professionally or otherwise, it tends to be meaningful. 80% of that, so good relationships with people, with your loved ones, with friends, colleagues, and so on and so forth. But 20% hedonia, meaning pleasure. So use pleasure as a spice that it's not absolutely necessary for life, but it certainly does make it better, more pleasant.
I like this. I like that a lot. That kind of distribution of our time on these things. Yeah, 80-20. Got to remember that. Now, you mentioned meaning, and one of the goals with this podcast is to think about how philosophy, and practical philosophy in particular, can help us define purpose and meaning in our lives, if it can. I personally believe that it can. I would be curious to hear if maybe, I know this could probably fill several books, but is there maybe a quick take that you have on, has your practice of philosophy brought some sense of purpose or meaning to you? And what does that look like?
Sure. I guess the overall, I'm generally an introvert and don't want to go out and do things in the world. And so I can credit Stoic philosophy directly to some mild political activism that I do in New York State currently. And I got a lot more politically involved, and I find it is a great motivating factor to be more active in the world. And I still have some trouble getting out. I don't know. I just, there's a paper I was a co-author on that just got published, and then I forgot to put it on social media or LinkedIn or whatever you're supposed to do, because I just kind of hate all that crap. And which is, it's fine if I don't want to do it. It is not fine from a virtue ethics perspective that I hate it, therefore I don't do it. So it's actually an exercise for me to self-promote a little bit, but because I don't like doing that kind of stuff. But just generally being more involved in getting out there and trying to make the world a bit better in various ways, a little more publicly, I can credit mostly to Stoicism.
I'm going to highlight that is interesting. The first part you said about political activity, because there are people out there who say Stoicism is terrible because people just turn inward and work on themselves and they don't care. We know that that's not what Stoicism really should be, right? From our perspective, it's not just the inner citadel, quote unquote. But I think there are people who have that misperception. What do you think, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, a large part of the history of Stoicism and all Stoic major figures kind of is evidence against that. The people who were living the philosophy during the time it was flourishing were not private figures who just hid out. We have plenty of examples of them not doing that. That if somebody believes that Stoicism is just self-focused in a negative way, in an egotistical kind of way, then it's pretty clear that they're misunderstanding the philosophy.
I want to make a comment about that before you go back to the question of meaning. So yeah, I wonder, in fact, if Greg would agree with this assessment. So sometimes I suspect that this notion that Stoicism is not political and all that sort of stuff isn't yet another kind of misconception similar to how most people think of ethics today as opposed to the way we think of ethics, right? So as you were saying earlier, ethics or morality is often used just as a beat up other people on their head. And the modern approaches to ethics, to moral philosophy, are either Kantian deontology or consequentialism. Those are the two big ones. I mean, there are others, but those are the big ones. And they tend to be sort of universal approaches to ethical question. The question is always only simply, is this action right or wrong? And the answer is always universal. The way we tend to look at ethics in terms of, like the Greco-Romans did, is ethics is about your character, it's about your own inner growth. And there are no universal right or wrong actions. It depends on who is doing it, what the circumstances are. That's not relativism. I want to be very careful. But it does depend on the circumstances. So that switch of perspective might engender the misunderstanding that, so Stoicism is not about ethics at all, because it's not about the way ethics is normally understood. I wonder if something similar goes on there with the politics. Stoicism, as far as I know, does not propose an articulate universal theory of moral philosophy, like a Kantian would do today, or like John Rawls would do today, or something like that. But that doesn't mean that they're not political. It just means that they take politics to be an active member of the polis, of society. So to try to do whatever it is useful and good for people here and now without being too much bothered by these kind of universal answers that they can be questioned, they are not necessarily useful, etc., etc. So I wonder if there is that kind of this understanding fundamentally about Stoicism. Stoic politics is at a personal level, but it doesn't mean in the sense that it's not a system building thing.
Mhm.
But there is nothing wrong with that, and arguably there is something quite positive.
Yeah, because it allows for a whole bunch of diverse opinions. I mean, I've had this conversation a few times. I think that political spectrum, a lot of people with different politics in modern sense can be Stoics. It rules out some versions of politics for sure, namely fascism, because the defining characters of fascism is our group is better for because of some mythological past, and we must exclude the outsiders so we can get back to that mythological past. And that is directly against Stoicism. But you can be a traditional conservative, you can be a socialist, you can be liberal, all sorts of stuff within a Stoic framework because different people have different perspectives. And politics is hard, and getting to the facts of the matter is often even harder. So there's a room for disagreement, and people also are situated differently. And so will have different perspectives overall. It doesn't dictate a system, it just dictates action to make people more pro social overall. And if you're moving in that direction or think you are, then that is part of Stoic politics.
Okay, so back to the issue of meaning. So fairly early on in my life, I reached the conclusion that so far I have not had any reason to revise, that there is no cosmic or universal meaning out there. Meaning is not external. We are meaning-making creatures. We need meaning, but we make our own meaning. That said, I don't think that we make it up arbitrarily. It's not, as I said, there are some human activities that might be fun, but they're not really meaningful. Very few people would build a life around certain activities and think, oh, that was a life well spent. So I think that meaning comes from the kind of being that we are, which is what the Stoics probably would have argued. Certainly what modern versions of virtue ethics, like Philippa Foot's natural goodness, for instance, is been arguing. That is, what we find meaningful depends on what kind of biological and especially social creature we are. That's why one of the main sources of meaning is good relationships with other people. Is projects that involve others and make you feel good. You literally have a rush of pleasure hormones when you help other people. I mean, it's a thing that comes out of biology. So there are certain things that we find naturally meaningful. And then, of course, there is also the further complication that a lot of human evolution over especially the last 20,000 years, let's say after the Neolithic Revolution, has been cultural more than biological. And we still don't understand, quite frankly, how exactly cultural evolution works. Comparison with biological evolution. Biological evolution is pretty simple by comparison. So there is a lot that we need to learn, but it's clear that there are some patterns. There are some things that most people, unless you're a psychopath, you don't find meaningful, and other things that people do find meaningful. So meaning is clearly not the same for everyone, but there are some broad parameters, I think, that are general enough that a philosophy like Stoicism can be pursued with profit by most people. Not the only one, not the only option out there, obviously. But so in my individual case, the practice of Stoicism has made a particular difference in this sense. I've always been an academic, which means in part, and, unlike most academics, I actually like teaching. So, most academics will tell you that teaching is a distraction from research and scholarship. I love scholarship and research, but I also love teaching.
Right.
That has also always been a source of meaning for me, because you're helping other people understand things. However, up until I started writing about virtue ethics and Stoicism, all of my books were really about either technical academic matters or things that don't really change people's lives. That may be interesting. Let's say a book on pseudoscience. It's interesting. I find it interesting, but it's not going to change your life. It's not going to say, oh, wow. Ever since I started writing about Stoicism, I get a constant stream of testimonials, and people tell me, that thing really helped. I was going through a crisis. It really helped. In some cases, it changed my life. In most cases, it was really helpful in a moment of crisis. That makes you feel good. That is a additional layer of meaning, because again, it's about other people. You're helping other people. So you're not only doing something that is helpful to you, not only writing, which in my case, it's fun just for its own sake. It's an activity that I do for its own sake. But on top of that, it's actually helpful to people. So that has definitely added an additional layer of meaning to my life.
That's really great. I love that you're hearing from people, and sometimes I do too, and it's really rewarding to know that it helped somebody. Does your philosophy bring you joy?
I would say probably not, with some mild instances. And that's by intention. I think overall, people bring that emotions like joy into the equation a little more often than is necessarily healthy. And I think practicing Stoicism proper will occasionally lead to non-joy. However, there are some exercises or things or mental frames that sometimes do. The one that comes to mind also comes from William Irvine's later book, The Stoic Challenge, where you kind of think of that this is the last time you'll do something, whether it be something mundane or something non-mundane. So like I still get a little spark of giddiness when I like contemplate indoor plumbing. Like that stuff's amazing. Like I could get like cool water that I could drink, and then like I turn the other knob and it gets hot, and then like I don't have to dig
Right.
a hole for basic bodily functions. That's great.
That
Like,
is great.
and I do like so that kind of stuff, and also like spending time with loved ones as well. Like it kind of brings an extra appreciation. So I would say a little bit, but I not too much, and that is by design, and I am
By
perfectly fine with
design.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I think that joy is a little bit overplayed and overestimated. I mean, there are some things that, of course, are joyful, but they tend to be, at least in my experience, they tend to be specific occasions. You know, joyful on the day that my daughter got married, for instance. Yeah, but that lasted a few hours, and that's it. It's a temporary feeling, which is very nice when you have it, but it's not like I'm going out of my way to try to experience it on a repeated basis. What I do find, and there the philosophy, what I do find meaningful and sustainable, and their philosophy does help, is a sense of contentment and satisfaction and appreciation, as Greg was saying, for things that maybe I would have taken for granted. I mean, the indoor plumbing is certainly a good example, but I travel a lot. And for me, the whole notion that I can get on a thing made of metal and a few hours later land on the other side of the world and go and see friends, that's wow. I mean, come on.
Pretty
It's
fantastic.
a
Yeah.
miracle. It's pretty
Yeah.
fantastic, right?
Right.
But it doesn't bring joy, except that maybe in the moment in which I see my brother again after a year or two, that's joyful. But other than that, is mostly contentment, satisfaction, and appreciation.
I guess it also depends on how you define joy. A part of why I asked the question was Bill Irvine's book. That was one of the first books I read about modern Stoicism, and he talks about Stoic joy in his title or subtitle. And I think in his case, he's defining it also as sort of a sense of tranquility, an ability to tune out all these sort of pressures and noises, instead focus on what really matters, which I do think could be a form of joy. I mean, I think that there's an interesting kind of way in which we define these emotions. I mean, for me, I think the Stoicism has helped me build confidence that I'm going in the right direction, that I'm making better choices, and that I know what matters. And that actually does bring me joy personally, because I feel that, otherwise I feel, rudderless and kind of stressed and just, at the whims of our current culture, which has a lot of problems, right? And will tell you a lot of bad goals and a lot of bad messages about yourself and about what you should be doing. So instead, turning back to kind of the Stoic concepts and the way I use practical philosophy to sort of help make better choices, help understand my choices as having roots in this more elevated way of thinking rather than just either pure instinct or, as I said, consumerism or, cultural influences that I might not have chosen. So maybe that's also the choice aspect. Stoicism really focuses on choice.
Yeah, I mean, there is a famous phrase in Seneca's letters where he says, "My dear Lucilius, you have first and foremost to learn how to feel joy." And then you
Mm.
read that paragraph, and it's like, wow, and this is a Stoic talking about joy. But then, if you keep reading, so if you read it in context, it's clear that what he means by joy, it really means satisfaction at your own virtue and your own understanding of things, and a good life. And I'm completely behind that sort of
Yeah.
meaning of the word joy. Absolutely.
Right, right, right. Well, maybe for a last question, I wondered if I could ask you, what would you recommend people reading, practicing, thinking about if they want to get into practical philosophy and they want to get into Stoicism?
I guess I would probably go with three places to start. The first is the introduction to William Irvine's A Guide to the Good Life. I think that is an interesting and very readable book, although I ultimately think it does not portray Stoicism itself accurately. However, its introduction in just a couple of pages gives a great motivation for why care about a philosophy of life in the first place. So just those first few pages, the whole book is worth reading as long as you understand that it may not be Stoicism proper per se. It's kind of a take on Stoicism, but the introduction is great. The other two places I would recommend turning to are the book that Massimo co-edited with Sky Cleary, How to Live a Good Life, I believe it's called, which is essentially a collection of essays that goes over a whole bunch of different life philosophies and expands way further out than our book does. It goes over, there was an effective altruist who was interviewed or wrote an essay in order to discuss practical utilitarianism. There was Buddhism, and then there were other philosophies of life as well, including modern ones like existentialism. So that's seems like a great place to start as well. And the third and final place I would recommend is if you want to take a look at what the Greco-Romans had to offer, our book, that's why it's there. And I think it's okay. Conflict of interest declaration, none.
I think it's
But
okay.
oh, okay, fine. So I think we did a decent job. You did a great job. I did an okay job. So so I think
You also did a great
third
job.
place to go.
All right, guys. Yeah, I think I might agree actually with those recommendations. It's always hard for an author to be put in a situation of answering that question because, of course, we do have certain very clear ideas about which other authors are worth reading and maybe not so much worth reading, but it's kind of hard to come out and say. So other than what Greg has just said, if people want to bring it up a notch or two, I would say pick up one of the books by Pierre Hadot, either The Inner Citadel especially, or Philosophy as a Way of Life.
Right.
Probably The Inner Citadel is certainly a better introduction to Stoicism, although it's a little bit more heavy going than most books that are available these days. That would be one of my suggestions. Another one is The Stoic Challenge by Irvine, which we mentioned a number of times. I really think it's not an overview of Stoicism, but I really do think it's a good book that it's well written and especially very useful from a practical perspective. And then I think at least one of the books by Don Robertson, there's one that is specifically about the joy of Stoicism. I forgot the exact title.
Stoicism and the Art of Happiness.
There you go, that one. And I found that very useful. That was one of the first things that I read. It's certainly written from a modern perspective of a cognitive behavioral therapist. So I found it particularly convincing because it immediately merges the ancient philosophy with the modern science, which again, to me as a scientist, is an unqualified plus. If you tell me something that was thought 2,000 years ago, but it seems to clash with modern understanding of things, then I'm going to be a little bit more skeptical.
Yes, excellent. These are all really good recommendations. And of course, if you go back to ancient sources, the handbook of Epictetus is short and sweet. And that's one of the places I started with. And I've always loved Marcus Aurelius, although I know that it's more poetic and literary in some ways than, pure philosophy or, explanation of how things should work for a Stoic. I think it's also inspiring for some of us because it shows kind of a lived experience of Stoicism in someone's thought process, which is really interesting. But your recommendations on these books are great.
I would say also, if we're talking about ancient sources, Seneca's letters.
Yes.
A modern classical scholar, Liz Gloyn, has suggested that the letters are actually an informal curriculum in Stoic philosophy. That is that Seneca, it's 121, 124 letters, something like that. And you can see a progression of topics. The first letters are short and often include references to outsiders like Epicurus, and then they get longer. Epicurus is dropped, and Seneca goes both into more depth on topics that he has already treated before, or brings up entirely new things like aspects of Stoic metaphysics or natural philosophy. It's a really fascinating book, and it's kind of, because it's arguably the last thing, or certainly one of the last things that he wrote in his life. It's also his most mature thought about Stoicism.
And as a writer, it's very writerly. It's very beautiful prose, and just a pioneering kind of way of presenting really essays that really draw you in. So I also love Seneca. Well, thank you both. Maybe not, not to be too self-promotional, but could you maybe both add how to follow your work or how to connect with you if people would like to do so?
Sure, I have a personal website where you can connect with me, and I occasionally post stuff that I'm connected to. It's Greg Lopez or GregoryLopez.me. They both go to the same place, M-E, like the pronoun.
Great. Massimo?
In my case, most of the stuff that I published is on Substack at a newsletter that is called Figs in Winter, which is, as you know, a reference to a phrase by Epictetus.
Thank you both. It was great talking to you.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having us.